Imagine 3 months ago a war broke out in the Middle East, a war that had been put off because everyone was afraid to start it for 3 whole decades. And today, the former Secretary of State, the man who sat in that very room where such decisions are made, and who never dared to make that decision, sits down and writes a phrase in the Wall Street Journal that, well, shook half of Washington. Some people were left breathless, others clenched their teeth. We're not the ones in trouble as they expected from her, and we're not the ones stuck there as people thought. So, as an ideological opponent of Trumpism and so on, she's there. By the way, she's not an ideological opponent. She's too smart for that, Condoleezza Rice. And she writes, "Thank God. Thank God. Gentlemen, time favors us." She's no longer discussing the elections, but something else. And in that same week, at the very same time, the House of Representatives votes for the first time to take away from their own president the right to conduct military actions. That is, he says, "We have a law in our country, in a way, Mr. President, 215 against 208. Well, that is by a small margin, but still a majority, right? 4 Republicans are switching to the opposing side. There is applause in the hall. So, the president in a rage writes that they should be ashamed. Well, he has his own thoughts on the matter, of course. He's negotiating and the other one is putting a spoke in his wheel. 2 scenes, the same moment in history, and they seem to be telling completely opposite things. One says that America is winning, and the other says that America is splitting apart. So, who is right? That's what I promised to reveal to you by the end of this story. You will understand 3 things that, for some reason, no news broadcast explains today. I mean, in 30 seconds, they rush through and explain nothing. First, is the war won or lost? Why does the answer depend on how you actually define the word victory? And second, can Congress really stop the president? Or is it just a show like a clown act? A clown act? I'll show you the exact mechanics, gear by gear. And third, the most important thing. As always, why does this whole story, despite all its anxiety, end on a note that simply cannot exist on the other side of the front in Tehran? Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. The last part will change the picture a little bit. Just a little bit. Let's start with the facts that everyone agrees on. On February 28, the United States of America, together with Israel, launched strikes on Viren. Not a border skirmish, not an exchange of pleasantries, but a full-scale military campaign. 3 months. In April, a ceasefire is declared. It's weak, fragile, unreliable, the kind where clashes flare up again and again, and yet, so to speak, nevertheless, it somehow keeps going. This so-called ceasefire, right? And against this backdrop, Condoleezza Rice picks up his pen. I want to say it again. She is probably one of the smartest people who have ever worked in our governments. Her thesis is both simple and bold at the same time. The war has fundamentally reshaped the Middle East. And it reshaped it, according to Condoleezza Rice, quite recently. She is not a person from our current president's team. In favor of America, Tehran came out of it weaker. Israel is stronger. And President Trump found himself with a historic chance to secure long-term stability in a region that hasn't known stability in living memory. Notice how carefully she phrases it. She doesn't say, "We achieved a decisive military victory." No, she honestly admits that there is no such victory yet. The Ayatollah regime has not been overthrown. He still sits there in his underground palaces, and some are in above-ground ones, right? But Rice suggests viewing this from another perspective. Victory in war is not always a flag over the enemy's capital. Sometimes victory is what the enemy can no longer do. According to her, Iran can no longer do many things. The 3-month campaign has undermined Iran's ability to project power, she writes. Now think about this expression, projecting power. For 30 years, Iran was feared. Not so much because of its own army, but because of its long reach. The stockpiles of missiles with which it kept half the region under threat, right? A network of proxies, in other words, fighting through others without getting its own hands dirty. Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in the north, squads all over the Middle East. That was the real power of Tehran. Not tanks at a parade, but the ability to reach anywhere, while seemingly staying out of it. Russia claims that it is precisely this capability that has been struck, and they won't recover from it easily. And now, in her opinion, who has gained the most? Not Isha, but Israel. In this regard, Israel has never been safer, she writes, and that's a strong statement considering how it all began. October 7th, 2023, of course. Yes, the most terrible day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It seemed like this was the point of greatest vulnerability. And Reis draws a line through these 2 years and says, Jerusalem's military response after that attack seriously weakened the terrorist groups supported by Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah. What began as a catastrophe turned into, in her words, the greatest security the Jewish state has ever had, the greatest in all of history. History, she writes, creates such plots that no screenwriter would dare to imagine. But the most interesting part, Rice seems to save for later. The war, she says, didn't just weaken Iran, it accelerated something that had seemed impossible for decades, namely cooperation between the U.S., Israel, and key Arab countries. Intelligence sharing, joint defense. And here's a detail you should focus on. Many Arab governments that just yesterday saw Israel as enemy number one, well, whether they really saw it or not, that's what they said. Yes, today they see cooperation with the Jewish state as a source of economic and technological growth, as a path to modernization, to move from, say, the 17th century where they were, into the 21st. Why did this happen? Ask yourself, what brings people together the fastest? Shared love? No. Shared fear? A common enemy? Iran, with its aggression, achieved what decades of diplomacy could not. Iran scared the neighbors even more than Israel ever did. And they started reaching out to each other. This is one of those secondary effects that aren't visible at the moment, but over the years they redraw the map. And over the years it turns out that they were the most important thing. Gentlemen like Putin. Putin scared NATO. You understand, right? Putin scared NATO. And it started to unite. That is, two people made NATO more cohesive. Putin scared them and Trump made them give money. Well, all right, let's get back to our business. Next, Rice moves on to what the war has exposed inside Iran itself. And here are 3 revelations. Each of these strikes at one of the myths about the regime's omnipotence. The first myth: the leadership is invulnerable. It turned out to be vulnerable. In the face of American military power, intelligence, and the capabilities of its allies. The second myth: Iran holds the world by the throat through oil, through energy markets. If it pulls, prices will soar. Everyone will come crawling. It turned out that this leverage is limited. It exists, but it's more limited than everyone thought. Yes, Iran managed to disrupt shipping through the Hormuz Strait, and a huge share of the world's oil, gas, and even fertilizers passes through it. Yes, Americans felt it at the gas stations. Prices jumped. Inflation strained people's wallets. That's true, and we'll discuss it later. But the threat to disrupt or cut off turned out to be painful, but not fatal. And now, the third myth, probably the most important one again, the nuclear program. That's what all of this was ultimately started for. And here, before I tell you what Rice writes about the nuclear bomb, this is probably the key paragraph of her entire article. I'll take a short pause. If up to this moment you've heard at least one idea, just one, not even 2, that made you look at the news differently, not just glancing at the headline, then please like and subscribe. This isn't about the numbers. It's a signal to the platform that a calm, substantive analysis without any hysteria is still needed by someone. And as it turns out, there are fewer and fewer people like that. Subscribed? Well then, let's get to the bomb. It will be a long time before Iran is able to create a functional nuclear weapon, writes Rice, who has access to all the classified data that exists in the world. Well, in the world, in America, right? If you know America, in Israel, in the United Kingdom. And according to her, this is the main result of the entire campaign. Not territory, not a change of power, but nuclear ambitions set back. And over there, maybe the emperor dies, maybe the donkey drops dead, whatever else happens, like, we'll come back again. We need honesty here. And Rice shows it. She doesn't say that the threat is gone, right? She admits that Iran may still have stocks of highly enriched uranium. Well, raw material. A bomb isn't only about the materials. It's an entire chain. Conversion facilities to turn that raw material into a usable form, networks of centrifuges to enrich it to the required level, and people, scientists. Those very minds that hold knowledge you can't buy in a store. Well, depending on the store, you're right. And this chain, Rice claims, was dismantled during the campaign. The uranium might still be there. But the plant that weaponizes uranium, the people who know how to do it. No, not everything is as good in the Iranian, so to speak, kingdom as they try to say. Knowledge which is being targeted turns out to hurt more than metal. And from this, Rice develops his strategy for the future. Tough, without sentiment. She urges the Trump administration not to give in to calls to ease sanctions, not to make concessions in future negotiations. She says it so convincingly you can't argue. Tehran should not receive a single cent from the frozen assets. Or, for example, the easing of sanctions. Why so categorical? Because she remembers well how it worked before. Well, it already happened, right? The regime got money, and it didn't spend it on schools, libraries, and hospitals for its own people, right, but on rebuilding the army, on funding terrorists. Give him resources and he'll restore exactly what was just destroyed. This is exactly the new way of thinking about consequences. Not what we got today by signing the deal, but what will come tomorrow. If we give Iran the money and time to act. She ends her speech with what I think is the heart of the article, directly admitting the regime hasn't been overthrown. But Tehran is now weaker and more isolated than it has been in recent years, so there is no need to rush. Strategic patience is difficult and does not always bring satisfaction, she writes at this time. But time is on the side of the U.S. and its allies, and the final flourish, which every negotiator should have carved in granite. No deal is okay. A bad deal, no. No deal is okay. A bad deal, no? Well, basically repeating what Trump said. Remember this wording. We'll come back to it later. Because it's exactly what explains everything that's happening in Washington right now. And at first glance, what's happening there is the exact opposite of strategic patience. While Rice writes about patience, a different kind of patience is running out in Congress. And here's a question that most news outlets answer incorrectly. What exactly happened in the House of Representatives? Did Congress declare war? No. It's actually the opposite. Congress tried to stop the war. They tried to take away the president's right to wage it. Well, in accordance with, how should I put it, the laws that were passed at the time. To understand how this is even possible, you need to look at the very foundation of the American system. According to the Constitution, only Congress has the right to declare war. That's Article 1. But at the same time, the President is the Commander-in-Chief. That's Article 2. Well, do you feel that slight, subtle contradiction? It's been smoldering for 2 centuries. Presidents conduct military actions. They don't declare war. They make war formally, citing the fact that they are Commanders-in-Chief. And Congress looks at this and thinks, wait a second, actually war is our prerogative. And so after Vietnam in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act. By the way, they passed it over the president's objections, overcoming Nixon's veto, 2/3. 2/3 of Congress. And 2/3 of the Senate, as I understand it. That's the essence of the law. The president can send troops into battle. He can. He has the right. But he is required to notify Congress within 48 hours. And he must end the operation within 60 days if the legislators have not given permission. This is, if you will, a kind of emergency brake lever that Congress keeps at hand in case the president, in their opinion, goes too far. And this Wednesday, for the first time, they pulled that lever. The House passed a resolution on war powers, a document requiring Trump to stop military actions against Iraq without separate approval from Congress. The vote was 215 to 208. A razor-thin margin. It's not even about the margin, it's about who crossed the line. 4 Republicans broke party discipline and voted with the Democrats. Applause broke out in the chamber, and it became clear. The rift wasn't between the parties. The rift ran within the president's own party. Trump responded instantly and in his own style. He called the vote meaningless and the move unpatriotic. He wrote that this was a stab in the back, right in the middle of his final negotiations to end the war. He typically, as they say, accused the Democrats of being driven by Trump derangement syndrome. He said that they would rather see the country fail than let him achieve a victory. But he reserved a special portion, sorry, for his own 4 Republicans. He wrote that they are posers playing to the crowd, and he himself is not a poser playing to the crowd. But we love him. They should be ashamed. Here's the main question, which is likely why you started this video. Will this resolution stop the war? Will it make Trump stop? And this is insanely interesting, because this is typical American politics. Well, the short answer is almost certainly not. Almost, because there's a chance. Now I'll show you why. Not based on emotions, but on the mechanics. For the resolution to become binding law, it needs to pass through 3 doors. The first one, the House, passed, barely. The second door, the Senate. Well, there, they just pushed through a similar measure. There hasn't been a final vote yet. Even if there is, the margin will be razor-thin. The third door, the president's desk. And this is where Trump takes a pen and writes veto. And that's it. He said he would do that. And to override this veto? Easy. You just need to have 2/3 of the votes in both chambers. Not 215, but 290 in the House and 67 in the Senate. The opponents of the war don't have numbers anywhere close to that. 4 defectors. That's a big deal, but it's still far from 2/3. It's still a very long way off. And that's not all. Even if you imagine that the resolution somehow passes, the White House has already covered itself legally in advance. The War Powers Act comes into play when there are hostilities. And the administration says, what hostilities? A ceasefire was declared in April. Hostility is stopped, and there's absolutely no need to start the clock. There's nothing to approve. Of course, that's a shaky argument. I would say, as the same press writes, the strikes keep flaring up. But for legal cover, for a fig leaf, that's enough. And now add this to Trump's own motives, and you'll understand that he doesn't intend to stop under any circumstances. Secretary of State Rubin, speaking in Congress, just said this directly. If lawmakers tie the administration's hands, the Iranians will decide, and nothing will happen to us. Why make a deal at all? The resolution actually moves peace further away, not closer. Taking away the main trump card from the negotiators, the threat, add optics to that. For Trump, being forced to stop means looking weak. And that, well, directly contradicts his narrative. I've forced Iran to the negotiating table. And add that very phrase, Rice. Better no deal than a bad deal. Well, everything comes together at one point, right? That point is called keep pressing. Then why even bother voting at all? If, according to Newsmax himself, yes, it's pointless. And according to, well, let's say, so to speak, the very parliament, I meant to say, Congress. Yes, it's symbolic, but not legal. This is the subtle point. The power of this resolution isn't legal, it's political. This is already the 4th attempt to restrain the war, and each time the number of votes goes up. This means that the coalition supporting the war is cracking. Slowly, it's cracking. War is expensive, gentlemen. Over $100 billion has already been spent. You can feel the war at the gas station. Prices have jumped. The Strait of Hormuz is disrupting trade. And ahead are the midterm elections, which we've talked about 100 times already, where the Republicans' position is collapsing. It's being decided who will control Congress. And here's what's important to understand about Trump. He will stop the war not because a piece of paper tells him to stop. He will stop it if and when politics, cost, losses, elections, and a disrupted recount make continuing more expensive than stopping. I'm not talking about money right now. Money is part of it, but it's not just about that. So, a resolution is not an emergency brake. It's a clock, a political clock that Congress has wound up and put on the president's desk. Tick-tock. The coalition is melting away. Knock. Count the days. He is counting the days. By the way, there's one detail to keep an eye on. The Senate version is privileged. It can be brought to a vote, whether the leadership likes it or not. If the Senate also votes in favor, Trump will have a resolution on his desk passed by both chambers. Well, of course he'll veto it, yes. But the political embarrassment before the elections will be on a whole different level. And now the reason I asked you to stay until the end, the very part that turns the whole picture upside down. Take another look at these two scenes we started with. The former Secretary of State publicly challenges the current president's strategy in the leading business newspaper. At the same time, he says that under no circumstances should a bad deal be allowed. So go on. 4 lawmakers from his own party, they openly vote against him. They get applause in the hall, but let the Democrats applaud them. It doesn't matter. The president, furious, writes that they should be ashamed. And so what? Nothing. No one was arrested. No one was dismissed. Not a single one of those 4 disappeared by morning, ended up in the hospital with a diagnosis, or even fell out of a window. They just came to the next meeting and voted again. Well, not about Ukraine, not about Lebanon either, for some other reason. And now turn your attention to the other side of this war, in Iran. Whereas we have just found out the regime is not held up by the people's love but by an apparatus of coercion, where taking a protest sign into the square means a bullet. Try writing an article in Tehran saying that the supreme leader has chosen the wrong strategy. Try breaking party discipline there. And that's the whole answer to the question I asked at the very beginning. So who is right? Is it the scene about victory or the one about division? The West, ladies and gentlemen, is winning. Because what looks like division from the outside, a dispute, a vote on the edge, switching sides, that is actually strength. The strength of a free society, not its weakness. Although it may seem like, oh, what a horror, weakness. No. A dictatorship cannot allow disagreements, and that's why it will shoot it down. And it rots from the inside without knowing it until all reason collapses. The freedom of disagreement is spoken aloud, in the light, under applause, under cursing. And that is why it corrects its mistakes while they are still fixable. Iran looks strongest exactly 1 day before nothing is left of it. And a society that argues openly looks chaotic every day. And it stands. And it stands. And it stands, because as soon as there's rot somewhere, it's immediately brought out. Here it is. And they try their best to patch it up, fix it, redo it. That's why time really is on the side of the free. Not because we have more missiles, but because they have something that no dictatorship has. By they, I mean the countries of freedom, right? We can make mistakes. To admit it out loud, to turn around, to shout, to scream, to pull at braids, to swerve, anything at all, right? And to keep moving, correcting the path. But the Iranian regime lacks this ability, by its very nature. So no matter how menacing it may look today, in the long game it has already lost. And the people who took to the streets under gunfire in 1990 and in 1917 and in 2022, these people will have their say again. The doors that a wise ruler once opened as an exile in history will sooner or later open again. We just need to live long enough to think it through and not trade victory for a bad deal. Don't trade victory for a bad deal. If this analysis, ladies and gentlemen, helped you see the structure behind the headlines, please give it a like. Share it with those who tend to believe the first headline they see. See you next time. If you're someone who likes to think deeply and broadly, I have a second channel for you, a roadmap to freedom. There we don't discuss today's news. Or rather, we take today's news and try to use it as an example to understand the root of what's happening. Why do free societies outlast their gravediggers time and time again? And how step-by-step entire nations climb out of the pits they've been driven into. Time and again. Check it out. The first coffee chat will reveal something. Take a look at the roadmap to freedom, 10 minutes each. I think there are, how many are there again? 192 if I'm not mistaken, or hour-long ones. 16 or 17 hour-long conversations, well, 10 minutes in the morning each day, and oh, you will be enlightened. That's all. Yes. One more thing. For those who ask me about the book, how to buy it and so on, there's a store below the video. So, and well, it's not just some t-shirts, there are all sorts of funny things with our phrases, quotes from my books, and so on. The very first thing is the book. So just click on it, and everything there is very easy and clearly explained. Goodbye, to be continued.